They didn't take my silence as strength, they mistook it for surrender. But I had been quietly building my war chest. The early October air bit through Elias Munro's flannel shirt as he adjusted the collar and stepped into the barn. The sun had just begun its reluctant rise, casting long, golden streaks across the harvested field. His boots crunched over dry leaves, the kind of sound no boardroom ever offered, but one he had learned to live with. Or rather, one he pretended to. From a distance, the old farmhouse looked quaint, white-painted wood, faded green shutters, a wraparound porch. But inside it was wired with high-speed fiber, multiple encrypted terminals, and a wall-sized digital dashboard tracking grain futures, agricultural tech acquisitions, and weather analytics. 3 months had passed since he walked away from the Monroe Agrotech boardroom without a word, not because he didn't have any, because no one was listening. His phone buzzed. He didn't need to look at the screen to know it was Kenneth. He answered anyway. Still breathing out there in the sticks, Kenneth's voice oozed sarcasm. Elias stared at the horses, grazing beyond the barn. The sticks are quieter than Wall Street, son. You should try it sometime, Kenneth chuckled. I'll pass. But hey, good news. Monroe Agrotech's Q3 reports just broke projections. I'll send you the press kit just in case your horse wants to read it. The line went dead. Elias lowered the phone and let it rest on the stable railing. That boy used to ride shotgun in his pickup truck, marveling at crop rotation algorithms and vertical farming models. Now he sent mockery from glass towers, thinking that age dulled insight. But that was Kenneth. Efficient, charismatic, ruthless in the way that only the second generation of wealth could afford to be. Elias walked back inside. On the dining table, a steaming mug of black coffee waited, prepared by Martha, who had been there when Monroe Agrotech was just 3 greenhouses and alone. Your son's calling again, she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. He nodded. Still thinks I'm just playing with hay. She placed a folder on the table. You're not, and they'll figure it out too late. Elias smiled faintly. They always do. He opened his laptop and clicked through charts and reports. On the surface, he was a retired man planting tomatoes. But buried beneath spreadsheets were signals Kenneth's aggressive mergers, some done without proper shareholder approval, some under shell names with foreign addresses. He clicked on a flagged document. Then another. MRT Group Limited had begun acquiring supply chain vendors that Monroe Agrotech once owned outright. Elias's eyes narrowed. A shell company was being groomed for something big, something hidden. He closed the tabs. Not yet. Patience had built empires. His mind drifted back to that boardroom 3 months ago. Kenneth, in his perfectly tailored suit, stood before the board with a slideshow titled Next Gen Leadership for a New Era. He spoke about innovation, speed, and risk tolerance, and then about legacy. Monroe Agrotech needs to shed its skin, Kenneth had said, voice sharp. And that begins with the board rethinking who leads us into tomorrow. My father's tenure has been long and foundational, but our future requires a different engine. The motion passed in silence. Elias offered no rebuttal, just placed a manila envelope on the table, his resignation and a small stack of untouched reports on shadow acquisitions that no one cared to read. Now the world had moved on, but Elias hadn't. Later that evening, as dust settled and the sky bled into shades of amber and gray, Elias sat by the fireplace, laptop open. The inbox pinged. From anonymous subject, MRT 982, reorg PDF, attachment 1 file. He downloaded the document. It was a restructuring plan. MRT Group was set to absorb Monroe Agrotech through a silent reverse merger using unaudited subsidiaries and artificial valuation pumps. A hostile takeover cloaked in compliance. He sat back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. 4%. That was what he still held. Not publicly declared, not yet traced. A small percentage, but just enough to challenge the quorum if things got loud. Outside, the wind rattled the porch. Inside, the silence wasn't empty, it was loaded. They thought I walked away with nothing. But I left with the one thing they underestimated: time. Not every betrayal is loud, some are etched into the silence of closed boardroom doors. The overhead fluorescence cast a harsh glare across the long oak table. It was past midnight, but Elias Monroe sat in the boardroom of Monroe Agrotech as though it were midday papers. Neatly arranged sleeves rolled the room empty, except for the ticking of the antique clock mounted above the projection screen. He stared at a single contract and agreement with Eastern Agri dated 6 months ago. Everything looked legitimate on the surface, except the signature on the approval line wasn't his. It read K. Monroe, and the date had been backdated by 2 weeks. He hadn't signed this version. His fingers traced the edge of the document, eyes narrowing. That contract had been one of his final executive initiatives before stepping down. It was meant to secure long-term regional distribution in the Southeast. But this version had been changed. Behind him, the door creaked open. Rachel Lynn entered, carrying 2 steaming cups of black coffee. "You shouldn't be here this late, Mr. Monroe." He glanced up, the voice quiet. "Neither should you." She placed the mug down and sat beside him, eyeing the contract. "I ran a timestamp analysis," she said. "That version was printed from a private server. Not company standard. I didn't authorize it." "Let me guess, Elias said Kenneth's project." Rachel hesitated. "He asked the IT director to install a backup system off books, encrypted. Said it was for confidential innovation files." Elias leaned back. "Innovation? That word's been covering sins since before you were born." They sat in silence, broken only by the hum of the HVAC system. Elias tapped his pen against the table, then flipped open a file folder labeled Legacy Strategic Models. Inside were notes from his last 12 months as CEO. Buried near the bottom was a draft memo, a report on projected merger vulnerabilities with smaller biotech firms. Only this copy had been altered. "This was mine," he murmured. Rachel leaned in. "What's wrong?" He held the document up. "I drafted this memo 6 months ago. It had a very specific recommendation not to acquire a biotech group called Vernix Labs. This one," he pointed, "it recommends we buy them, and the approval isn't mine. It's Kenneth's." Rachel's eyes widened. "Can we prove it was changed? Only if we find the original copy." She looked hesitant, then leaned closer. "There's a secondary server backup the IT director told me off the record. It mirrors internal drafts before they're committed to main storage. But access is restricted. Deep restricted." He turned toward her, voice low. "Can you get in?" Rachel met his gaze. "If we get into the secondary server, I think I can restore it." There was a long pause. Elias nodded once. A soft knock interrupted them. The door opened and Reed Marlowe stepped in, loosened tie and a bottle of rye in hand. "Late nights suit you, Elias," he said with a half smile. Elias gestured to the seat across from him. "Only when truth hides under paper." Reed poured 2 glasses, slid one across the table. "Remember when this room smelled like ambition?" he asked. "Now it just smells like fear." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Yours?" Reed chuckled. "Not exactly. But there's talk. Shareholders aligning, legal memos floating. Kenneth's moving fast, and not everyone wants to be left behind." "Left behind," Elias echoed. "Or bought off." Reed drank. "Call it what you will. Just know, this play has been brewing for more than a year. You were never supposed to see it coming." Elias said nothing. He studied Reed's face, noting the lines deeper than last year, the fatigue behind his eyes. He wasn't the enemy. He was someone watching the tides and trying not to drown. "Some tides," Elias said slowly, "are worth swimming against." Reed didn't reply. He just finished his drink, set the glass down, and left. When the door clicked shut again, Rachel stood. "I'll check with the IT lead tomorrow." "No," Elias said. "Tonight, before anything else disappears." She nodded and gathered her things. Alone once more, Elias closed his eyes briefly. The silence in the boardroom wasn't just from the absence of people. It was the echo of decisions made elsewhere, in shadows, in corners where voices dropped and documents shifted. He looked again at the altered memo fingers, resting gently on the edge. The betrayal hadn't shouted. It whispered. He turned to Rachel. "Can you restore the original copy?" Rachel nodded. "If we get into the secondary server..." He walked into the room like he already owned it, and maybe he thought he did. Kenneth Monroe's stride was unmistakable, slow, calculated, not rushed, but not humble. He wore a gray tailored suit that caught the light with each movement, and a thin smile played on his lips, as if the outcome of the meeting had already been written in his favor. His eyes scanned the conference room like a man surveying a chessboard with pieces already arranged for checkmate. Elias Monroe watched him quietly from the far end of the 12th floor conference table. The chairs around them filled slowly. Directors, legal counsel, senior project managers, all waiting for the quarter's strategic presentation. But the air was wrong, tense, heavy with anticipation. Rachel Lynn sat to Elias's right fingers, already on her keyboard. A small lapel mic pinned beneath her blazer silently captured every word. Kenneth adjusted the slide deck on screen. Let's begin. The first 30 minutes were predictable. Numbers, trends, projections. Then came the pivot. Kenneth clicked to a slide titled Monroe Agrotech Restructuring Proposal. We've identified a significant opportunity, he announced, to transition away from traditional agriculture. It's outdated, margin-thin, and labor-heavy. Our new focus should be intelligent systems, AI automation, biotech analytics, scalable platforms. He paused, letting the word legacy hang in the air like a fading echo. Elias folded his hands. And the agriculture division, Kenneth smiled thinly. We'll be divested. We've had quiet offers. This could free us to lead in innovation. Silence crept across the room. Elias spoke again, voice even. Was this plan approved by the board? Kenneth turned. It was voted on electronically. All board members had access to the resolution packet last Friday. Rachel didn't lift her head but slid a single printed page toward Elias. It was the email distribution timeline, metadata verified. The vote emails had been sent at 3:24 a.m. on a Saturday and closed at 7:00 a.m., a 4-hour window. Elias examined it briefly, then looked up. That doesn't meet protocol. The bylaws require 72 hours for major structural decisions. Kenneth's expression stiffened. Protocols evolve. So does litigation. The room chilled. Kenneth chuckled, though his jaw clenched. Are we really going to make this personal? Father Elias didn't blink. No, I'm making it procedural. Reed Marlowe shifted in his seat. Two directors exchanged glances. Elias slid the page forward for the others to see. I will file a motion with the SEC if vote tampering continues. As a shareholder, I have that right. And as a founder, I have the obligation. The silence that followed was complete. Even the hum of the projector seemed to hold its breath. Kenneth placed both palms on the table and leaned forward. We're moving this company into the future, Elias. You had your time. Elias returned his gaze. And now I'm using it wisely. Kenneth abruptly gathered his laptop, eyes no longer masking the irritation. As he passed by Elias, he paused, bent slightly, and whispered low enough for only two people to hear. Godfather, it's really time to retire. Then he walked out, leaving a silence louder than his words. Rachel closed her laptop, exhaled slowly. We have the email log, the timestamp anomalies, and now a verbal threat. Elias stood calmly. Good, let's give him more rope. A single line of code, sometimes that's all it takes to burn a dynasty down. The server room beneath Monroe Agrotech headquarters hummed like a living organism. Racks of blinking machines lined the narrow walls, their cold blue lights casting long shadows on the concrete floor. It was past midnight. No employees remained save for the two figures standing in front of the terminal. Elias Monroe leaned against the steel cabinet, arms crossed. Rachel Lynn sat at the console, fingers dancing across the keyboard. The glow of the monitor reflected in her glasses, and lines of encrypted data scrolled rapidly before them. Backdoor access is in, she murmured. Kenneth buried everything under a dummy archive labeled Product Testing Archives Q4. But it's not product files, it's financial restructuring logs. Elias moved closer. What exactly are we looking at? Rachel expanded a subfolder. Transactions routed through a fund called Kelton Equity Holdings. They bought over 12% of Monroe Agrotech shares privately, and the approvals came through a sub-account ID hidden under the R&D Expansion Eastside Initiative. Elias narrowed his eyes. There is no Eastside Initiative. Rachel nodded. Which means the expense reports are fabricated, and the fund linked to one of Kenneth's former business school classmates. Elias finished. Rachel looked up. Exactly. Elias pulled out his phone and dialed. Reed. I need you. Now. Basement level. 20 minutes later, Reed Marlowe appeared, trench coat still dripping from the late March rain. His face was tight pale. He carried a small black case. I figured this was coming, Reed said, setting the case down. Elias gestured toward the screen. You signed off on this ghost account. Why? Reed hesitated, then rubbed the bridge of his nose. Kenneth has leverage, An old video. College days. Stupid, reckless, and bad for the brand. You're the CFO, Elias said quietly. You're the gatekeeper. Reed's jaw clenched. I tried to stall, but he knew the loopholes. He used me. Elias didn't flinch. Then stop being used. He stepped forward. You only have one chance to prove you're not a coward. Silence hung between them, thick and loaded. Reed finally opened the case. Inside was a portable hard drive and a stack of sealed envelopes. The original financial report, he said, and the unedited clip. What Kenneth showed the board was a version where I confessed to falsifying numbers. This one shows I warned him it was illegal. Rachel's eyes widened. Elias took the drive and examined it for a moment. This changes everything. Reed didn't move. His hand lingered on the edge of the desk. Do you really believe me? He asked quietly. Elias looked up. I don't need to believe, he said. I need you to be afraid of the truth. The pen is mightier than the sword, especially when it's attached to a subpoena. The chandelier above the grand ballroom of the Manhattan Plaza Hotel gleamed like the tip of a blade, ready to fall. Rows of chairs lined the carpeted floor, each occupied by a shareholder director or legal observer. On the stage, a long oak table stretched across the width, polished to reflect the tension in the room. Elias Monroe stood at the center, hands resting calmly on the edge, dressed not in resignation, but in quiet command. He didn't begin with a plea nor with fury. Gentlemen, ladies, for decades, Monroe Agrotech stood for innovation, but more importantly, it stood for transparency and honor. We do not trade our values for margin gains. And yet here we are. A hush settled as he stepped aside. Rachel Lynn, in a navy blazer, tapped her tablet. The large LED screen behind them lit up. Charts unfolded, funds routed through Kelton Equity Holdings, sub-transactions buried under false R&D initiatives, ghost accounts masking ownership shifts. In the past 3 months, Rachel explained, millions of dollars in internal shares were rerouted to external parties in violation of corporate policy and federal disclosure laws. Kenneth Monroe, seated at the end of the table with his entourage, chuckled. Dad, he said smoothly, you're dragging ghosts into a boardroom. These charts. Anyone with Excel and a grudge can mock this up. He leaned back in his chair, smug. A fantasy. A quiet cough echoed from the back of the room. All heads turned. A man in a gray suit with steel gray hair stepped forward, briefcase in hand. Elias's lips curled faintly. Thank you for joining us, counselor. Attorney Jacobs, once Monroe Agrotech's top external counsel, now semi-retired, walked slowly to the front. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and placed it carefully on the table. This, he said, is a formal notice of evidence submission to the Securities and Exchange Commission under Rule 10b-5. Falsifying material facts in financial reporting is a federal offense. A ripple of gas moved across the room. Jacob scanned the stunned crowd. And if any individual here has knowingly supported, hidden, or failed to report this conduct, congratulations. You're now a witness or a defendant. Silence. Kenneth's jaw flexed. For the first time, he seemed truly still. Elias met his eyes. Do you have anything to add? Kenneth, the room held its breath. Kenneth smiled, not the grin of a man cornered, but of one with a hidden card. From the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, he withdrew a black USB drive. He twirled it once between his fingers. You still think you've won, Dad? His voice was soft. He set the USB on the table gently like a ticking clock. Checkmate isn't declared when the king is cornered, but when every escape has been sealed. A week had passed since the storm at the Manhattan Plaza Hotel. Now the executive boardroom high above the streets of New York was colder than the steel frame supporting it. Frosted windows muted the city's chaos. Inside, no one spoke. Kenneth Monroe sat at the end of the long mahogany table. The USB drive he had brandished 7 days earlier now rested beside him. His hands were folded, chin tilted upward, confidence carefully reconstructed. Elias Monroe sat across. He looked like a man with nothing to prove because he didn't need to. Attorney Jacobs adjusted his tie quietly. Rachel Lynn sat to Elias's left, tablet ready. Reed Marlowe on the right leaned back, arms crossed. Then the door opened. Janet Cole from the SEC stepped in. Her black suit matched the folder in her hand, stamped with the agency's insignia. Before she could speak, Kenneth rose. I believe he said it's my turn. He plugged in the USB. The screen flickered, then displayed a grainy clip dated from a board meeting years prior. Elias appeared stern-faced in mid-conversation with the director. I don't care what the bylaws say, the distorted audio played. If they're in the way, change them. Kenneth smiled. Seems Dad's always had a taste for control. Gasps. A few eyes flicked toward Elias. Elias didn't flinch. Rachel stood and tapped her tablet. We anticipated you'd try that. The screen switched. Same video, but now restored voice, clear, uncut. I don't care what the bylaws say if they're misinterpreted, Elias was saying. If they're in the way of ethical transparency, change them through due process. Silence. Rachel added. This footage was edited. The original is time-stamped and verified by the primary server backup. Kenneth's face hardened. You're bluffing. Janet Cole stepped forward. We've already received the full version from Ms. Lynn, and as of this morning, our investigation has officially expanded. She opened her folder. Not into Mr. Elias Monroe, she said, placing several sealed notices on the table, but into Kenneth Monroe and 5 named associates under Section 302 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Kenneth froze. Jacob stepped beside Elias. It's over, son. But Elias raised a hand. I'm not here for revenge. He pulled out a slim folder of his own. These, he said, are proxies from the neutral shareholders. They now represent a controlling interest. He placed the stack gently on the table. Effective immediately, Elias continued. Kenneth Monroe is asked to step down from his executive role pending investigation. The board members nodded, some in shame, some in quiet relief. Kenneth stood. For a moment, he looked like the young boy Elias once took fishing, angry, proud, not yet understanding consequence. At the door, Kenneth turned back. Dad may win this time, he said bitterly, but he can't stop the new era. Elias's voice was steady. The era of the unscrupulous will never last. The door shut. And with it, the dynasty began anew, rooted not in noise but in quiet conviction. They thought Elias Monroe was finished. But in silence, he had built the foundation not just for a comeback, but for a reckoning. In the end, it wasn't noise or rage that brought justice, but quiet persistence, truth, and a refusal to compromise with corruption. Like the final move in a long game of chess, his victory wasn't just about power, it was about restoring the rules of the board. Perhaps standing up today means you'll never again have to bow to injustice tomorrow.